Welcome back. Welcome to everyone. Wow. Welcome to everyone on Zoom and everyone in the room. Welcome back to the workshop in the history of material text. My name is Zachary Lesser. I'm a professor in the English department. I run this seminar along with two people who are not here today, Jerry Singerman, humanities editor emeritus at the Penn Press, and John Pollock of the Kislak Center. They're both still, as they were last week, in Berlin for the opening of the What is Enlightenment exhibit that Liliana Weisberg has put on. And so they will be back with us next week. But we do have the wonderful Peter Diamond, Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text, who makes sure everything goes smoothly here. And I'm glad to see all of you. Those of you on Zoom, please remember to mute yourself, but the chat is open. Peter will be happy to surface questions during Q&A or use the raise hand function and we'll call on you live. Coming up next week, Alan Farmer of The Ohio State University will talk about lost books in the early modern book trade. Following that, on November 4th, we have Lisa Gittleman of NYU speaking on typographical hallucinations. So if you're joining us today for the first time, I hope you'll come back for those. If you put your email on the sign-in sheet that should be going around, then Peter will add you to our listserv and you'll get just 1 or 2 emails a week announcing the upcoming talk and providing the Zoom link. And anyone on Zoom who's not on our list but wants to be, you can go to our website, pennmaterialtext.org, and just click the link to subscribe yourself to the listserv. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome Dorothy Berry. She holds an MA in folklore and ethnomusicology and an MLS as well, both from Indiana University. Before that, she graduated with a BA in music from the much beloved and mourned Mills College. For those of you who don't know, my introduction to Mills College was that they sold off their Shakespeare first folio in 2020 for $9 million in an attempt to stave off closure, but it didn't work. And they're now part of Northeastern University, which I know has been a huge loss to many alumni. Dorothy Berry is a leader in the fields of digital collections and librarianship, cultural heritage, African-American history, and Black bibliography. She has received Library Journal's Movers and Shakers Award in 2020-21, which cited her as a remarkable force for positive change. She also won the Society of American Archivists Mark A. Green Emerging Leader Award in 2021. Both of these came during her years as Digital Collections Program Manager at the Houghton Library at Harvard. Prior to that, she served as Metadata and Digitization Lead in the University of Minnesota Library System. So she's now moved and shaped her way to her position at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, where she leads projects in digital interpretation, digital humanities, and digital outreach for this internationally acclaimed museum. Dorothy has published on authentic accessibility in digital libraries in Transactions of the American Philosophical Society, which I mentioned because it's one of my favorite journal titles, like the most
It's just super exciting.
august title for a journal, and obviously a highly scholarly venue, but she also publishes frequently in more public forums like LARB, Lapham's Quarterly, the Public Domain Review. And I really urge you to check out her brief essays in JSTOR Daily, which I enjoy greatly. For instance, on comparing multiple editions of David Walker's Appeal, or on when Black celebrities wore blackface. These essays achieve the difficult task of being rigorous, pithy, highly engaging, and broadly accessible all at once. She's been invited to give keynote presentations and to lead seminars at the Rare Books and Manuscripts section, at the Digital Public Library of America, at the Music Library Association, at the SAA, OCLC, the Association of Moving Image Archivists, Bibliographical Society of America. This list gives you a sense, I think, not only of the range of her interests and expertise, but also of the fundamental importance of the kind of digital curatorship and librarianship that she does to every field. So I'm thrilled that she's able to join us today to share some of her work on the Johnson Publishing Company archive. Please join me in welcoming her to the workshop.
Sure. Wow. That's real tough to follow. Thanks everyone for coming today for this talk. Reading a digital collection, the Johnson Publishing Company archive in process. I'm really pleased to be able to speak with you all this evening and to hopefully spark some fruitful conversation. I'm also a bit nervous because I think this topic and its framing are at the far end of what the material text workshops generally address. And because as a multi-institutional work in progress, there are levels of specificity and decision-making that I cannot make transparent at the moment. With these caveats out of the way, however, I'd like to think on how mass digitization affects our relationship to the material possibilities of archives. Transitioning from special collections to museums is a constant reminder of the arbitrary yet enormous gaps in understanding across cultural heritage fields. Working in a museum that has acquired the physical stewardship of a large, in-demand archive has forced me to wear a haberdasher's worth of hats, including resident archives knower. With that hat on, I was recently in a meeting discussing the physical build-out of a research center to store and provide physical access to the Johnson Publishing Company archive. One of the project managers working to ensure we actually get things done. You've really not worked on a cross-institutional project until you've been on half-hour calls with at least 3 project managers sitting in. Shared that she was surprised to learn that some archives restrict physical access to materials that are digitized. Feeling the need to defend my preservation-focused colleagues, I interjected that this is a move designed to save wear and tear on materials, especially fragile ones. Another colleague jumped in with, as a scholar, and began talking about how the need to handle and experience an object is key to their praxis. As the description went on, I interrupted to get us back on track, saying, we all care about materiality, but this is about resources and practically running a center. I start this with this anecdote as my bold, we all care about materiality clause has completely convicted me as I sat down and began thinking how I would rise to the level of a material text workshop. My work has primarily focused on dematerializing, digitizing materials to increase access, adding interpretive context to ameliorate the singularity of images floating in digital space, and rethinking archival description as it functions in the mediated, but not necessarily facilitated spaces of digital discovery. This focus has narrowed more in the past 2.5 years as I've served as the first digital curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where I usually gloss my responsibilities with the museum's digital interpretation is within my portfolio. The Johnson Publishing Company archive has become the physical collection that consumes most of my time and will serve with what I hope is a useful object lesson. And if I was a different sort of person, perhaps useful provocation around what it means when we treat physical archives as primarily digital content, and how access without material contact shifts our understanding, and what responsibilities may or may not exist when working with Black archives in digital spaces. The Johnson Publishing Company is best known today as the publisher of Jet and Ebony magazines, but the firm's reach, and by extension, this archive, is much broader. John H. Johnson founded the company in 1942 with a $500 loan staked against his mother's furniture. Johnson began publishing with Negro Digest, which was envisioned as a reader's digest for Black readers, and eventually expanded with an eye towards completely cornering that market, with periodicals like Tan Confessions, Hue, Copper Romance, Black Stars, Ebony Jr., Ebony Man, Ebony South Africa. Johnson was very openly a committed capitalist with an entrepreneurial spirit, expanding into fashion fair, a cosmetics line with a national series of touring fashion shows, a book division, television programming, and even their own radio station, WJPC. Material across all of these divisions are represented in this archive, which was purchased for $30 million by a consortium led by the J. Paul Getty Trust, the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and the Mellon Foundation. The collection is contractually co-stewarded by the Getty Research Institute and the National Museum of African American History and Culture, developing digital and physical access collaboratively across institutions, with sometimes overlapping and sometimes markedly different professional and intellectual subjectivities, has presented many opportunities for education, and has presented even more questions that remain to be answered, not just for Johnson Publishing Company archive, or as I'm going to call it, JPCA, but regarding mass digitization and access across the field. JPCA, as one might imagine, is one of many archival collections that relate to the most influential Black media producers of the 20th century. This collection is most likely the largest and definitely contains some of the rarest materials. It is comprised primarily of the working photo files from over half a century of production. Unpublished images from photo shoots, unseen works from photographers like Monetis Lee Jr., layouts, cover designs, so many unpublished and unseen materials. The title of the talk references the collection in process, which is both a physical reality. A team of 8 or so colleagues under the leadership of head archivist Stephen Booth are seemingly at all times and at every hour working to create the massive folder-level finding aid promised to cover the thousands of linear feet in the neat hierarchical lines that are our field standard. The process I am interested in sharing with you all, however, is less about the specifics of our workflows and how they came to be, but is more the intellectual processing of how digital collections relate to the material world. In many ways, I am processing this experience as it relates to my own art background as a Black archives theorist, digital special collections specialist. Basically, I am processing. With all of this front matter in mind, I've framed the rest of this talk as a series of questions to explore. Hopefully, at least one of them will spark your own questions, and our discussion time will lead us down some interesting paths. Some of these questions are ones I've been mulling in relation to digital collections over the course of my career, and others have been brought particularly to light by my mid-project insertion into this massive project. Question: is a folder on the reading room table the same as a folder on the computer screen? The obvious answer to this question comes from a commonly used term that I personally tend to avoid: digital surrogate. Scanned, photographed, digitized versions of physical materials are commonly described as surrogates, the thinking being that they serve as a functional simulacrum, granting access to a less accessible physical object. As technology moves forward, the concept of digital surrogacy feels increasingly less accurate when IIIF allows for levels of inspection beyond the human eye, and photographic techniques reveal the hidden substrata of ancient texts. Digitized photos take on their own complications in a time where photographs exist primarily as digital objects in everyday life. For most people, I would wager that in the decade plus, the amount of photos in their phone's reel outnumber the amount taken to be developed at the drone corner. That's not even getting into the ancient feelings evoked by viral videos of millennials pantomiming a camera clicking and Gen Z holding out an invisible phone. For many people, the digital photo supersedes the physical, with little thought to the impermanence baked into their files. These contemporary understandings of digital pictures meet a roadblock when it comes to special collections discovery. There are known knowns of finding a digital picture, scrolling through Pinterest and being shown an algorithmically calibrated selection of consonant images with and without useful sourcing or titles. Google image searching for a string of natural language words that somehow, or at least used to, bring you exactly what you were thinking of. Descriptive practice for photo catalogers and archivists are designed with assumptions about researcher ability and researcher interests that do not necessarily take into account the desire to see something cool. Archivists bringing in the ofness versus aboutness argument complain about photo catalogers describing everything about the material and the production of an image, with the content and broader context being ignored, though photo catalogers point out that their description is relevant to those studying particular aspects of photographic history. Catalogers get stymied by the commitment to more product, less process-led folder-level description, where a grouping of images is described corporately, focused on that context and relationship. The Getty Research Institute and the National Museum of African American History and Culture are both institutions that primarily describe their collections as catalogers, which is quite reasonable given the bulk of their collections and their distinct institutional histories. The Johnson Publishing Company archive is being processed at folder level as an archive, a practice designed to streamline description and to put an end to the lockdown that archives used to be on, when waiting years to allow access so every item could be named. This style of archival processing works especially well for describing the JPCA, as it originally existed as business records. The naming of folders comes directly from what's written on the folders by staff, and the ordering reflects the same. One of the times that respect de fond and original order has a tangible research value. Folder level description is sometimes described as sufficient for reading room access. Enough information to get a researcher to a folder that, based on their subject expertise, they feel is likely to have the information they are looking for. How that description works in a digital space where access for all is highlighted, but all are acknowledged to not necessarily have subject expertise, is a question circling mass digitization of archives. Question: is technology's ability to invisibilize the archivist a bug or a feature? The reading room can be a fraught space. The researcher has a set amount of time to look at a set amount of material, facilitated helpfully or not by whoever is staffing the space, ranging across institutions from professional special collections reference staff to student workers more interested in getting their homework done than assisting discovery. For every archivist who has been helpful enough to a researcher to get name-checked in a monograph's acknowledgement, there seem to be an equal number of opposite experiences of alienation and a perception or reality of outright hostility, especially to Black researchers. Black researchers have shared their negative experiences in the reading room in articles and in anecdotes to one another. Credential doubting or assumptions of unprofessionalism have been shared as common experiences, and has a less quantifiable feeling of dissonance between the personal sacredness of looking at records relating to Black suffering in spaces that directly benefited from that suffering, like looking at documents around enslavement in buildings funded by sugar crops. A collection like the Johnson Publishing Company archive in some ways is excused from the latter issues. Its by us, for us creation story, and the fact that the majority of the photographic images in the collection were taken with publication and by extension, public viewing in mind. Thinking about how experience shifts when an archive is presented digitally first and foremost, however, can change some of those known knowns about what is gained by removing the watchful eye of reading room staff. When writing that last sentence, I almost wrote removing the mediation of reading room procedures, but that is just another invisibilization. What could be more mediated than digital access? We can turn off or on access to a single image in the time it would take you to reload a page. Innumerable decisions from what download resolution will be provided, to what level of description is possible, to whether or not Boolean searches are recognized mediate how you access materials. What digital collections do very well, however, is invisibilize the degree that this user may experience themselves as being mediated. They may experience themselves as having a level of discovery that is impossible in physical spaces. Sitting at a reading room table, you may be allowed to look at one folder of photographs at a time, perhaps two if you've made a convincing argument about your need to compare to a generous reading room attendant. With the digital collection, you can scroll as many folders as your browser can handle, right-clicking a new tab until your virtual reading room table is completely overwhelmed. Partially post-library reopenings in 2021 and 22, but in times before that as well, much of reading room activity has transitioned to researchers attempting to get pictures on their phones of as many pages as they can within their allotted research budget to organize and to use for deeper research later on. This anecdotal reality, shared conversationally with colleagues in archives across the country, challenges the argument of a limited distraction and limited access slow viewing space. What I am not clear about, however, is whether this is a researcher's preference or the reality of working with limited resources. Working on a time and budget-mounded mass digitization project has led me over and over again to think about the perceptions of impossibility in workflows and the forced or chosen austerity of access and research. Question. When do we differentiate between unfeasible and unalluring? Across academia, we can probably agree on a shared fetch that there's hyper, under, and unemployment of qualified staff and a level of austerity that makes the idea of increasing staff seem laughable or cryable. Digital collections bring up the possibility of technology that can do work now deemed impossible, but can accepting that impossibility be an issue more of imagination than function? This is where I will very briefly delve into AI and digital collections. I want to, again, clearly caveat here that while the JPCA is the framing device around which my questions are posed, this section does not relate to any current or planned workflows around description and access for that project. It does, however, relate to questions that are reasonably asked about machine learning across special collections repositories and the desire to fill the space between efficient folder-level description and unfundable item-level description. There are some standard protocols in digitization that we didn't call AI or machine learning until recently, but are fairly described as such. Optical character recognition that allows for full text searching is a type of machine learning that has allowed for new and compelling forms of research, or at least has democratized forms of research that were once only available to tenured faculty with inherited wealth, and one of those wives who was revealed to later have been pretty much her husband's postdoc and administrative assistant and transcriptionist. There has been broad acceptance of this type of machine learning that does onerous work that is completely humanly possible, but not necessarily the best use of human time. Miss Ned Ludd over here, however, is suspicious of the ways in which not necessarily the best use of human time shifts into not what the university wants to invest money in, or not possible. Item level description has fallen out of favor not because archivists decided they hate it, but in response to balancing two very real concerns, one over collection control and one over researcher access. Repositories need to know what and how much they have. Repositories need to know what and how much they have, and researchers need to access material without decades-long embargoes. Those two concerns balance against further dimensions, like the people who describe the collections not being the people who acquire them, specialized knowledge and professional demographics, leading the item-level description to be strong and in-depth in some collecting areas, while others, historically often those dealing with Black life, remain minimal even when itemized. And even researchers valuing the serendipitous possibilities of physically examining all the contents of a folder and being able to discover something, as opposed to being directed to the single image that they already knew about. Much like old Ned, I've been referencing Ned Ludd all the time lately, and I'm not going to stop even though it's obnoxious. But much like Ned Ludd, my questions here are not for a general disdain of technology, but focus around the value of labor and specialized expertise. We are, some claim, past the initial concerns of let's not use AI for item level description because it will definitely produce a lot of racism. Although I don't personally think that we can be sure about that, or I think that that's probably not right. But more towards a potentially dangerous space of isn't something better than nothing? This is something of an unintended consequence of more product, less processes sufficient for reading room description being decoupled from the physical space of reading rooms. The question I'm mulling here is whether something is always better than nothing. Something inaccurate? Something sort of accurate? Is it intrinsically better to put something online within months, even with minimal or occasionally non-existent specific description, or to wait a year so the human can accurately review it? Does that question matter more than the number of angels on the head of a pin when no one is planning to fund that human labor anyway? And my concluding question: what do we want from archives? I hope this densely packed introduction to the JPCA and then rapid expansion beyond collection specifics into archival metaphysics has raised enough meaningful questions that your time feels well spent. I apologize for my inchoate rambling, but for me at least, that is the nature of a work in progress. The final question I have is, what do people actually want from archives? Meaningless in their imprecision, phrases like stakeholders, community, researchers, creatives, scholars are used to define the audience of a forward-facing, non-gate-kept archives field. But even broadly taken, these groups have different needs and wants that do not always share overlap. Scholars of photographic processes may benefit from data about dimensions, camera, film stock, data that takes resources to produce. Scholars of mid-century Black fashion may be less interested in that data, but might want specifics on who is wearing what in an individual image, not just a folder titled Fashion Fall 1960s. Creatives looking to transform images into installations and collage may feel their time wasted in working through archival hierarchies without a visual search. And community is a term of self-identification that can have as many met and unmet desires as it has members. I am at a point professionally where considerations about what we, archivists and archival users, want from archives feel fairly inscrutable. So I can really only answer that question for myself. If that sounds like I'm going to conclude on an answer, then I've tricked you. Because as I started out with, this is a collection in process.
Really provocative. I'm sure we will have questions based on your 4 questions. For me, a question I had never considered, but that has like considered me when I've been in the archive, is like this debate around folder level versus item level description. And could you just say a little bit more about the context of that debate for
Sure.
people like me who are not librarians and
No,
archivists?
I thought that when I was reading it. You're going to be under time. You could have explained what these things are.
Oh.
But so Mark A. Green and the other guy whose name I don't remember right now. Apologies. Do you know?
Meissner.
Thank you. Terrible with things that are important, like giving people's names. Basically published this piece that became universally installed in the field that was originally about dealing with government documents. And this is where we get this phrase, more product, less process. So the idea is, which used to be the case and still is in some institutions, that institution might get an archive and might process it by describing each item in a folder, depending on if they're really in the manuscript tradition, each page in a thing in a folder, and would not have scholarly access until that was completed. So that could mean you know that the collection that's the most relevant to your research is sitting there for 10 years, and you are not a prestigious person, they will not let you see it early. Some prestigious person they will let see early, and now your research has gotten sniped, and that's upsetting at a scholarly level, but it's also doesn't feel like the type of open ethic we would really love to have. So this has led to different levels of processing. Kind of, we think of box level, which is truly, here is a box that we think has this in it, and that is again designed to just let you see that box before waiting forever. Folder level, which has become the standard, just describing self-titled at the folder level. And then item level, which is much more rare and a lot of places kind of have outside of their accepted workflows. As originally intended, more product, less process makes a lot of sense and is very helpful for getting through these large backlogs, because every archive you've ever been to has a backlog. When implemented without thoughtfulness, it can lead to collections being not particularly more easy to find what you're looking for, even if they are delivered to you. And this can be especially true with sort of, you want to identify this folder by the most important things in it. And who decides what's the most important things in it? Now, perhaps the things that you are deeming most important either as a scholar or as a human being, whatever, are not described. So you don't know that they're in there. Alternatively, would they have ever been described? I don't know if they weren't described at the folder level. Again, it gets this sort of who knows.
But I can see that like the initial impulse might be, well, we'll just describe it at the folder level. And then, of course, we might have time, but you never have time because a new collection comes in.
Sometimes you do have time and you can go back and reevaluate description or see, okay, we described this collection this way and this one this way. We might want to go in, we might want to change how things are arranged, because the arrangement that you see in archives when you're a researcher in a finding aid is intellectual organization. It's not necessarily physical organization, which means that you can rearrange things for finding. But again, that goes back to the assumptions of physicality that I will then deliver this to you. And it doesn't matter to me as the, well, it might matter because it's annoying, but me as the person who's paging it, that now this collection's over here and this is over here, but you've all renamed them as the other collection. Mm-hmm. We did this at Houghton. I had a project to amalgamate all of our blackface minstrelsy material, which was spread over a lot of different collections and also a lot of single item manuscripts. But thinking user focused, people that wanted to do that research should just know that they can go to one thing. That's easiest. And, you know, that took a lot of time to do intellectually, but also the act of physically, nothing was moved on the shelves. But yes, that is where we get to difficulties with digitization, because, and there are colleagues who I really respect who disagree with me totally on this, but most digital image searching, especially for something like contemporary-ish mid-20th century photographs, is at the item level. JPCA provides some interesting counters to that because it really is the records of a functioning publication. So some folders are clearly a photo shoot, which you would want to see sequentially. But even then, that is for a particular type of researcher, and it gets back to these questions of audience and what things mean.
Well, the floor is open. I didn't mean to hog the question period, so floor is open for questions. And again, use the raise hand function on Zoom if you'd like to ask. Sean.
Thanks, Dorothy. That was great. I wanted to follow up on your use of the term invisibilize, which I like.
Googled it to see if it was a real word. I don't trust Google anymore. I know. That's what I did. And then I was like, no, I think I can use this. And it's like a science word.
But I think, I mean, you and I have spoken before about the role of archival labor and the tendency to make it invisible, and to the extent to which that is, at least I would argue, is partly gendered and sort of bound up in sort of historical identity questions. But it's a really interesting notion that researchers are made to sort of feel that they're having an unmediated experience. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you are doing or what could be done to more honestly engage, I guess, with researchers in a digital space.
Yeah, I think one level, and I will not take credit for this, I will give credit for it. My colleague Stephen Booth, who is he's the head archivist for JPCA currently, but who is leading all of the processing of this collection, which is done in Chicago, and then it's sent somewhere for digitization and then sent to the museum. Because the collection originates in Chicago. So it just made more sense for various reasons. But Stephen has written what, when published, and I think if you email him, he can give it to you, a processing guide for the ages. Mm-hmm. That is, I mean, I'm sure we've all read a lot of non-radical published processing guides, but this one is a game changer. I make fun of myself, but it is a really compelling and really thoughtful about who does work and like naming that. And I think even the sort of, I want to say it's currently DAX required or compliant rule of when you make a change to a finding aid, needing to have that processing note that says who did that change and what the change was. Those things, again, are like, they are very much in the weeds of the work, but they're in the weeds of the work in the same way that having citations is in the weeds of writing. Which is to say, weeds in the sense of strong rooted and foundational. But to me, that's still very much an open question. And it is a reason why I try to, as much as possible at this stage in this work, name people who are doing the work. I just said recently that I don't like the phrase "the work," but name people who are working on this project. So in terms of making this material discoverable, that's Stephen Booth's team, which is led by him and Skyla Hearn, and a bunch of people who, as you saw with Green and Mesner, I cannot remember last names for. But Jacob, Jehoiada, other great people. But it is still, I mean, it's difficult because there's the invisibilization that I'm talking about that sort of, as you rightfully point out, is gendered and based on a lot of historical marginalizations. And then there's also sort of thinking, how much does the researcher care about this? And how much is it my responsibility or my prerogative to try to make them care? So I do this
So
filter.
the processing manual will be
I
public?
think so. I feel like that is a thing he has said. But do not hold me to that because I could be wrong. But I bet you could get a copy.
I mean, the hard part, as you suggested at the end, you're saying how much of this would a researcher really care about? How much really is in the weeds from that perspective, and how much isn't? Is that it's really hard to know in advance. I mean, there have been several recent research projects I've done where it's turned out to be really important to me to know when a catalog record was changed, and not so much by whom, though. If I had known that, they might still be around and I could write to them and find out more information, but to know even just when it was changed and how, could end up turning someone's argument one way or the other. But how would you know that in advance, and how would you allocate your resources? Like, you can't do it all. So anyway, there's many questions coming, so let's move on.
Hi, thank you so much. Not an archivist, a librarian, but I have processed an archive and I guess have been in this field long enough that have seen this sort of like moment when glam institutions saw Flickr as a place of hope for like crowdsourcing. And everybody digitized their collections and put them out there and thought, we're gonna solve some of these problems because people are gonna tell us, they're gonna identify. And for various reasons, as far as I know, that has kind of just died and fallen flat. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that and the kind of like, I don't know, it seemed to me like it was a moment of like maybe there's a solution and we're gonna let people sort of, there's still like transcription things, but when I think image collections, which are so difficult to parse without this level of description that you've talked about.
Yeah, I personally, for most projects I've worked on, not just like across my experience, I think of that sort of crowdsourcing description as more of an outreach activity than a descriptive activity. Because there's skilled labor in writing the interpretive description of images or papers that most people don't have and also isn't fair to try to farm out to people. Also, I always think of this example from when I was in grad school, an article that I surprised to no one after hearing me say this many times, and you'll probably hear me say it again, don't remember the author of. I wish that this was because I had other things I was remembering, but I think it's just that my brain is silly. But was about this kind of idea of crowdsourcing this earlier, so that would have been like, let's say 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, attempt to do a community crowdsourcing descriptive project with Native Alaskans around a museum collection. So this is folklore at the musicology school about sort of museum objects from the representative communities. And it was trying to involve young people and showing them these objects from their culture and having them identify stuff and give description. And then the researchers were really surprised that when you asked a teenager to describe something, most of them were like, grandma shoes. This looks old. I don't like, because again, this is where this weirdness of the kind of concept of community and outreach comes in. Not everybody who's, for instance, not everybody who's Black is a Black historian. A lot of people that are not credentialed historians have really good, like, might as well be. I'm not excluding the sort of like, you need to have X to be at this level of description, but there still has to be that second point. If I say, oh, that photo, I know exactly who that is my auntie. Someone still needs to probably check, because you could just be wrong.
This is what I have seen in dealing with these collections is the idea was we'll spend less money on staffing
Yeah.
by having, you know, the community, right? Supply the information that we need. And there's a sort of like, I think sometimes false and sometimes well-meant deference to like, we don't have the knowledge, but the
Yeah.
people have the knowledge. And then
It's a great way to not hire Black people.
it's a great way to not hire Black people. But then when what you get in the end is this, like, I mean, I love the idea of it being very much. But it makes me think also about like sort of searching for, how will we search for images that are on social media?
Yeah.
You know, when there is like, what is the role of metadata? That's a whole other question. All of which to say, I find your presentation indeed provocative.
Thank you.
Well, we have a couple questions on Zoom. Peter, do you want to unmute and ask, and then we'll go to Priya?
Thanks very much, Dorothy. That was really interesting. The question I have is about what is specific to digitizing, and many of the questions I thought you were really addressing are actually just the really important questions across every kind of cataloging and filing. You know, how do you go about? So just as you've got the problems of huge backlogs, every library has a problem with huge backlogs, particularly the Library of Congress. I mean, they basically don't catalog their rare books because, you know, it's incredible how many things they have. So the question there for me is first of all, one of the things I really liked about your filing system was that it's pre-filed. That's, if I understand you rightly, in other words, you can actually use the filing system that was there in the Johnson archives as your own filing system. And that's, to me, really important because many of us work on filing. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we had, was it 3 weeks ago, Craig Robertson works on filing and how filing works. And so one of the things that's happened in libraries is they often destroy the filing systems. And so you can't study it, literally. They dismantle them. So there you actually get libraries destroying. For me, the question of digitizing is a separate question, because the digitizing question, which I think is so important to do. I mean, the British Library was hacked and has been down for what? You remember 3 years or something, and it's totally screwed up thousands of people's work. You know, people working in the States, they're doing a PhD. They can't afford just to take off and go to England. You know, that it really is just undemocratic, in my view, to say, you know, that everybody should go and see the originals. And the other thing about this is that when it comes to digitizing, so looking at that side, Jim Green said that the great thing about needing the originals, one of the reasons we need the originals is because we can redigitize them, which is a wonderful way of putting it. In other words, you ask new questions, and some of the old, you know, I mean, Zach works on actually, you know, holes that are in the margins of books. No photograph is going to show that, you know. So but they can. They can actually, in the long term, they will be able to do that. So in other words, you can redigitize, and that's one of the great things. And I think the notion of digitizing fast and getting an archive up online is really important. And then when people start using it, you'll get redigitizing questions arising, even rephotographing, which has happened to many of our collections already. They've been you know, I think the Penn, someone can speak to this. I think all the photographs have been redone from what they were the original photographs. So the question really is about filing and cataloging. And I think both of these areas are completely occluded in, you know, people only talk about filing and cataloging normally to demonize people. It's to actually say what's wrong. If you find something wrong, you go after it. If things aren't cataloged and if they're not digitized, you know, most of the time we're just lost. So it's the fundamental starting. These are the starting points. You're lost if you go to the Library of Congress, because unless you know a librarian, they haven't catalogued things. You know, you just have to ask. There's nothing there.
I mean, there's people there that you can ask.
Yeah. But when I say, I mean, literally, no, there's no card catalog record. There's something. There must be something somewhere. But you know, there are whole huge collections that have never been touched.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is specific to archives is the idea of disregarding original order is more, I mean, I don't know if it is a rare books thing. I'm not a cataloger, never have been, but disregarding original order in an archives context is a major decision. That's a foundation of archival work, is keeping things in original order, a lot of times where it has far less meaning than it does in something like this. The questions of putting them online fast and then redigitizing them, most institutions do not do that work, will not do that work. There are rules around if this is available through a database that we pay for, we will not digitize this. I have worked with scholars who perhaps want, when I've been managing digitization in rare books libraries, who want a type of new technology, photographic technique, so they can see something, perhaps in a medieval manuscript, multispectrum, something like that. That's not something anybody has a budget for, unless you're bringing that budget in, and then the staffing. So there's a certain degree to which the idea of doing it fast and then going back to things is why we have the backlogs. And that goes to me again, perhaps before the question of cataloging and digitization, and to the question of acquisition. Why are you acquiring things if you can't make them accessible? I know why Library of Congress would, because I understand their generalized collecting mandate. But that's sort of especially at institutions that are wealthy enough to have curatorial acquisition staff and then technical staff that do processing and cataloging. Sometimes there's a lack of alignment around what OCLC would call the total cost of stewardship. There's the acquisition cost, but then there's also the cost of making it actually accessible. So I think digitization does play a bigger role, because the value of a person who knows this folder and can bring it to you and can give you some context is very different than when you're looking at something online and there's no one you can contact, or you don't know how to contact them. Examples, especially from something like JPCA, which is, as I said, these working records, there might be a photo in a folder titled baseball that is a photo of women at a party. Perhaps that is a photo of the wives of baseball managers at a party that was celebrating something for the Negro Leagues. But if you are just looking and you see this is in baseball online, you might think this is a mistake, because this is just some ladies. This is not baseball. That is where these issues of sort of moving fast to make things accessible in the context of archives, where there are sort of any single collection is hundreds and thousands of discrete items, perhaps can be more complicated, or complicated in different ways. I don't want to say more complicated than the idea, you can make a stub record for a book, even an early book or a rare book, that makes it discoverable enough for people that know about rare books. And stub records for archives are collections almost entirely mean you need to come see this in person.
Especially for images or photographs, maybe even more than other images, you're often liable to encounter them online somewhere else than the canonical home of that image, especially if you make them open. And we, it's very common that I'll be looking for something and some random website, through Google Images has it. And then if there isn't the kind of description at the home of that image, you really can get into some misinformation that's almost impossible to. You have to find where it belongs originally. So there's a case where I could see the question, is something better than nothing, is complex. And likewise, if you identify, just think of my own practice as a researcher, it's if a folder level description says, here's the 1 or 2 things that are important in the folder, I might be more likely to skip that folder than if it doesn't tell me what's the, but the real important thing for me might not be mentioned. And I might look at that folder if nothing's mentioned, but less likely to look at that folder if something's mentioned. So I think it's really hard. It's so hard to predict what researchers might do with a collection, and therefore like exponentially harder to predict how to describe the collection so as to achieve that.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think a lot of this comes to choices have to be made, not always that there's a really clear, this is the choice that is the right choice. That they do have to be made and then either stood behind or diverted, I guess, if they weren't, they aren't working. But even so, something like this women with baseball anecdote, I think of anytime I see baseball pictures in this collection when I'm working through it, I send them to my boss because he is a baseball guy. He's just like, it's a very classic, like I could send him a picture, which is to me, men playing a sport could be anything. And I will immediately get a message back that's like, well, what's really funny is that actually he had considered becoming a manager, but then in 1947, and I do that for the sake of him having the opportunity to share his joy of research of the Negro Leagues. But that's that other thing too of different audiences. If I'm just looking for baseball, but I'm not an Adam Martin level scholar of baseball, then I just would be confused by these ladies. I just like baseball.
Priya, why don't you unmute and go ahead?
Oh, thanks, Zach, and thanks, Dorothy. This was such a fantastic talk, and I learned so much. So this is a question. I'm not even sure it's a question, but it's a kind of a plea for your guidance, really, about digitized archives. Can you hear me? Is that
yes?
Okay, great. So the thing about digitization is there's a kind of inherent democracy in it, but to the point that Zach and others have made, there's also kind of dispersal that is a problem or can be a problem. So this is a question about that dispersal issue. Some years ago, I came across some material. I saw it in person, and then COVID happened. So now I was working off of the digital images, which were quite good. And I went down a rabbit hole. There's more material in the Library of Congress. There's more material here and there. This is all great, but it's about a Native American community. And as I started doing this research, which is not my area of study, I discovered that there's this enormous sense of ethic, who should actually speak for and about these artifacts. And I'm just curious if you could talk to that. I know you're not somebody who's sitting and sort of judging and about the ethics, but digitized archives seem to make everything flat. And I'm just curious, what does a researcher do who wants to be sensitive at the same time? What a great research question. And now I can do this work because I'm sitting in my study in West Philly and I have access to this material.
This is not an area of my expertise, but it's an area of conversation enough in the field that I can say some things. Sacred materials, I'll expand that sort of beyond only Indigenous people's collections, but sacred materials that have in-group limited access are broadly not things institutions digitize currently without being in relationship with. That is broadly across the field felt as unethical. Doesn't mean you can't still find that things might not have gotten in the mix, but that is, for reasons both ethical and optical, is perceived as a non-starter. There are, oh my gosh, I'm not going to forget the name of this. What is it? University of Washington has developed content management systems around community-based access. So let's say, but that requires a level of specificity and a level of, in this case, sort of codified community work to say, this image can be accessed by women over the age of 60 that are enrolled members of X tribe. That is a way of providing community access. Those sorts of rulings become exponentially more difficult when they are not concrete limits on community. Those could be tribal membership. It could just be, this is a very limited number of people that are still alive. Because especially this comes up sometimes when talking about Native American collections and African American collections, and some things that have managed to capture certain types of ethical considerations that aren't across the board. And sometimes that really does deal with institutions being more comfortable dealing with other institutions like a nation. That doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who is in that nation is in agreement, but it means that the institution maybe felt comfortable talking to a head of another institution. But there's not a head of any type of Black people that could speak for everybody. And even so, these are sort of these complications with that. I'd say ethically for digitizing, I feel like it feels like a less of a ongoing concern because it's so widely agreed that that is not the done practice. But I mean, frankly, if Library of Congress has something that's clearly not, that through your research should not be digital, I would email them because they probably want to take that down. Although then I guess you can't do your research.
Mhm.
I have a question and a comment from the Zoom chat. So Carol Kyoto has shared that program is called the Cordu.
Yes. Mercatu.
Thank you.
It's how someone told me I'm supposed to say it. I could be wrong though.
All right.
Thank you, Carol.
And then also Carol Kyoto has asked a question. I'm struck by your comment on the Johnson Archive as being assembled for a specific purpose for a specific community. As someone who has also read collections against the grain, like the Colonial North America collection at our former employer, how does your approach to description and interpretation change when the logic behind the collection is explicit at the outset?
I don't know that for me, it does change. Well, there's a certain sense in which the reading against the grain that I have done at like, let's say at Harvard, identifying and hopefully bringing more attention to materials relating to African American history and Black life more broadly in special collections is not something I perceive as reading against the grain. It's just reading the grain that I'm interested in. Which is, I guess, maybe a sign of my lack of respect to fawns. But in this case, I don't know, I think interpretation is always subjective. And there are still things as a scholar you might say about, the importance of Johnson Publishing Company getting Coca-Cola to use Black people in their ads, or their focus in early days especially, but throughout the jet especially, on having pinups in like every magazine. And the degree to which those pinups are cheesecake sometimes are surprising. I mean, yeah, there's some grown business in those publications. But yeah, I understand the question, but I think for me, perhaps the differences, the tonal differences that can sometimes be in the interpretive lane of museums versus archives. But even then, I feel like generally my goal has been surfacing and making discoverable Black history. So same job, different content.
Yeah, Jim.
Thanks. This is a great talk. I'm struck by the point that seems to come across here. It reminds me also of our previous presentation a few weeks ago on the history of filing cabinets, filing among corporations, and how that all developed and so forth, and how things are changing to the point that he made a comment just in passing that Amazon or is it Google Drive no longer is using folders. And it occurred to me, I realize now, I mean, that's what digitization is basically doing. And it's because we have a whole generation of people now who are used to just Googling something where you just type in a keyword, you get it right back. It flattens everything out. You lose your hierarchy and context. And I realize, since I'm an archivist and trained in the whole sort of respective phone perspective, but also work in institutional archives where hierarchies, the structures of records actually have a lot of meaning, just as they do like for government records. The problem of digitization, or I should say the challenge of digitization, is that it flattens things out so much that it takes a specialized skill to understand that this is part of a hierarchy, or where this, more importantly, I say, what is the context of this particular image that you're seeing on the screen, like of a letter or this particular document, and where is it within the collection? How does that relate to other things around it? And I think it's a bit of it's sort of the challenge we have when we present digitized collections, is we flatten it out, but also presenting the fact that this is actually fits within a certain structure, and that structure provides some meaning to what you're looking at, and not losing that, say, for researchers, or at least in a way presenting it. I mean, I realize we have this big struggle we're dealing with here in the library, where our library catalog was redesigned recently. And we have all the web, the IT people came up with, oh, this is a great way of doing it. We have tabs here, and this, and this. But the professionals are all saying, well, you're presenting information in a way that we're not used to seeing it, and it kind of takes things away. And so it's sort of trying to find the median between, making it easy for researchers, and also something that the tech people can understand, but also preserving the importance of the context that the collection has. It's a huge challenge. I think nowadays, as more and more things get digitized.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of that is that we do not do, and we being all archives across America, so we do not do a great job of explaining to users why that hierarchy matters. So if you don't know all of the things about why a finding aid looks the way it does, even if it's presented to you visually, that maybe doesn't have any meaning to you. And if it doesn't have any meaning to you, then it's easy to say, like, yeah, I just want to do a one search and get the thing I'm looking for. So that's the thing I have been thinking about, especially with the collection, of this scale of how do we provide, the sort of background on why this is this way. But even so, the knowledge being most people do not want to read that. And, I think of my colleague, Bets Cope, who did some, I think it was an American Archivist, an article about a user study she did of digital finding, of like web finding aids, not digital collections, but just the finding aid. And the results are sort of like, oh yeah, no one knows what this is. People would like to push Control or Command F. And by people, we mean like tenured professors, PhD. People don't know. Subject headings, we're like, there's all these rules for how subject headings work. People are like, oh yeah, those keywords. I assume that librarians pick keywords. And then you're, no, there's a whole thing. I'm not allowed to pick the words, the rules. And so as part of that, I think, is education, which is not something broadly that people that do like processing or cataloging have time to do, or training. Like, I think that's a structural failing, not really an individual failing of any type of worker. But I do think if that is something we want to maintain as being important, like we keep saying French stuff, like, people should know what that is and why that matters with certain types of collections, but also why, when I, let's say, intellectually reorganized all of the blackface stuff at Houghton, original order maybe doesn't matter there because there isn't any original order. Those were all purchased collections, and they didn't really document who they are of the Harvard Theater collection, but who bought what when is not public. So those, maybe the original order doesn't matter. Maybe the hierarchy there is less important. Something like this, we could say, I'm giving you a glimpse into how this company functioned. And so sometimes the order is self-evident, like alphabetical. There's a lot of alphabetical. And subject names and things like that. That's pretty clear of why is this folder called Muhammad Ali? Because that's who's in there. But sometimes even with something like that, it's a little less clear because it's, why is this collection? Why is this folder called Sophie Tucker? Because it's from an article about Sophie Tucker, but also Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, and Sammy Davis Jr. are in the pictures. Because this is how this company worked. They were making an article, they did a photo shoot. But yeah, I think that type of education, which is similar to like card catalog reading in the way that depending on where you're from and how old you are and what you were taught, different intersections of all of those things, seems like a thing one assumes people know. But if people don't know it, then it just feels like, why are you obfuscating it? Why is this so difficult? And sometimes even within the field with certain things, we're like, I don't know. I do not get to make this rule. But
Seems like with an archive like this, which is big and very rich in the sense that it touches on every possible topic of life during this period.
and the period is like
And it's a long
1950s through
period.
2000s.
So like the challenge is even greater there, I would think, because of course you're going to get academic researchers who, as you say, often don't know this stuff. It's not like the PhD. I can tell you, an English PhD doesn't teach you any of this stuff. But also you're going to get intensely interested communities, like your example of baseball. You'll get researchers who know so much about the history of baseball, who are not academic researchers, but are like brilliant researchers on that, or on music or fashion. There's all these areas of intense, quote unquote amateur research, and they will need different kinds of help navigating that, or it will matter differently to them. And people coming to write a biography of Muhammad Ali.
I mean, that is a really active part of our planning and thinking currently. We are going to be providing an amazing finding aid, and speaking to hierarchical representation, based on the Getty Research Institute's Research Collection Viewer, which represents hierarchy very clearly and well, perhaps the best of any finding aid PUI I've ever seen. But we've also been thinking of like, okay, so we know we're serving an audience with this platform. What are other things we might be doing? Some of those might be other digital things. Some of those might be programming and in person. So we both, I think that sort of broadness is both something that the museum works on all the time as a national museum, but is also, because the Getty Research Institute has their African American Art History Initiative, that this project for them is under within the portfolio of, we're all thinking of these different audiences and these different ways that people will want to get this material, but also that we will want to facilitate, and kind of working under the assumptions that once things are released, we will immediately realize, oh, actually people wanted this. And so this is
in a way, the Smithsonian is well positioned for that in a way that maybe a university archive is not, because you're very used to dealing with a wide range of the public. But in other ways, I imagine a museum might be less well positioned to host this kind in a way that a university special collections might have other kinds of. I don't know. That seems like another interesting fit to me.
I mean, I think either one of them would have troubles.
Oh, sorry. There's
thank you for a really intriguing talk. As a fellow archivist, I'm wondering, the company was producing a public product, but their records weren't necessarily meant to be public, and might contain controversies, might contain things that, the letters to the editor that never appeared in print, sensitive materials. And so I'm wondering how you're thinking about that for this collection, and do you think about it differently for the physical collection and the digital collection?
Yeah. So again, full credit to the processing team. I've just been talking lately about the sort of spectrum of more curatorial style archivists and more technical services style archivists. And I often lean this way, which is to say, I haven't processed something in quite a while. And usually I ask somebody who I know is more into it to correct whatever I think is a good idea. But full credit to Stephen and his team. We are looking at sensitivity. They have all of these are internal decisions that are not currently public, so I can't detail them very well, but we are looking at things like how can we mediate access, especially in contexts where the name might not make it clear to a user that what they're about to see. across a variety of intersections of things that are potentially difficult to view, including things that maybe were published, but if you don't know, this context. So we've been working on like technological solutions for those sorts of things. There are some things that will be restricted digitally. I don't think physically, but again, we actually don't have, like, that's in discussion currently. The business records are not part of the 2025 public launch, and I am not sure that they are. I'm not sure about their release, but I do know that the archives team again is going through any like personally identifying information, things like that is being flagged and either restricted or removed. Technically removed. No. So there's a lot of, we are very aware of both sort of obvious sensitivities like business things, like this has somebody's social security number or address, but also the more subjective materials, but that still thinking of user experience. And especially thinking of user experience perhaps outside of like, I'm a researcher of civil rights movement, and so I've seen a lot of stuff. But also, I'm doing a history day project for 9th grade, and I want to write about civil rights. My mom just lets me use the computer all by myself.
Time for one more question. Do you want to ask me? Go ahead.
It's okay. So I have another question. It's not quite logging or digitization. In terms of outreach, as the digitization cataloging project, the collaboration with GRI and with institutions in New York, has this invigorated or led to programs for educating and supporting Black bibliography or Black digital bibliographers? You understand what I mean?
Yeah, no, I get it.
People who are being not already doing the research, but just more people being dedicated to Black digital bibliography. Through programming.
I would say at the current moment, we are not at a brainstorming stage, but at, I just want to say ideating, which is a word that I think just means brainstorming, but sounds like it's more together. But we are at the planning stages around all sorts of programming outreach. I don't think Black bibliographers have made it to the list yet, but there's no reason why they wouldn't make it to the, like, it's that we're at that point of, okay, initially we might not have time to launch with national, that we don't have a national curriculum, but with education standards based K through 12 or whatever grade levels, teaching guides. That is something we excel at. We plan to do it though. How is our education? So it's sort of, we are at that point of, we have so many things that this collection can do. We need to start getting those down paper. We've been focused on a lot of this technical stuff. Now we're moving towards some point in 2025 public access to some of it. We know educators are a big audience. We also know our education teams need more time than that to actually do this work well. And they also need to be able to explore the collections and to do a million genius things that our educators do for that, like museum education audience. I think there's like archival education things. In the summers, we have we've been running for the last 2 years. Yes. A intro to conservation workshop for HBCU students. Maybe that expands to have more archives work. Maybe when we get the digital part, there's more digital humanity. Like, we are very much at this point of, everybody, what's your ideas? We have a million of them. So I would be interested in especially because some of the earlier magazines like Tan and Hue, I think will be publicly digitized or publicly accessible as digitized, not in 2025, I don't think, but soon. So yeah, I think that's an exciting area, but we are excited about a lot of things around this collection.
Well, you started out by expressing some concern that your talk would not be on the subject of material text, but I think the lively discussion and all the questions show how central this material is to this workshop. And it's actually been a while since we've had a really in-depth discussion of the questions, like in theory and practice, surrounding processing a collection like this one. So I really appreciated it, and I just want to everyone to join me in thanking you.